The origins of the African slave trade can be traced back to ancient times, when slaves, as war spoils and trade goods, had already been widely circulated within the African continent. However, with the rise of European powers and the expansion of global trade, the African slave trade gradually became a global commercial activity. In the 15th century, with the advent of the Age of Exploration, European countries began to actively explore and open up new routes, making the African continent an important trading partner. Most of the enslaved Africans transported to the Americas were purchased by Portuguese and Dutch merchants from local rulers in West and Central Africa. These merchants established trade relations with local rulers to secure a stable supply of slaves. The Portuguese founded the most famous European trading port in West Africa at Elmina in the 15th century, which became an important hub for trade between Europe and Africa. Portuguese merchants negotiated arrangements with important rulers, like the King of the Congo, to ensure a steady supply. In addition to Portugal and the Netherlands, other European countries such as Britain, France, and Spain also participated in the slave trade. These countries established their own factories and stations in Africa, trading European manufactures such as textiles, weapons, and alcohol for slaves and gold. These factories and stations were not only trade centers, but also bases for European merchants in Africa, where they conducted the acquisition, transportation, and sale of slaves. Slaves, primarily captured in war, had been a staple of African trade for thousands of years. Internal wars and conflicts within the African continent provided a steady stream of goods for the slave trade. Tribal wars, internal conflicts, and political struggles often led to large numbers of people being captured, who were then sold to European merchants as slaves. In addition to war capture, the internal slave trade in Africa also occurred through other means. Some African rulers, in order to obtain European goods, actively sold residents of their own or neighboring countries as slaves. Moreover, internal debts, crimes, and political persecution in Africa also led to large numbers of people being sold into slavery. These captured slaves were first transported to coastal trading ports in Africa, such as Elmina, and then loaded onto ships of European merchants for transportation to the Americas. The process of slave transportation was extremely brutal, known as the Middle Passage. Slaves were transported to the Americas in crowded, dirty, and harsh conditions, with a high mortality rate. The primary destinations for these slaves were plantations in the Americas, particularly in Brazil and the Caribbean. The climate and soil conditions in these regions were ideal for growing cash crops such as sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, which required a large amount of labor for large-scale cultivation. Therefore, slaves became the primary labor source for these plantations. However, over time, the slave trade market gradually expanded to North America, particularly in Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. Slave markets gradually formed due to the healthier climate in North America compared to the Caribbean. The African population in these regions naturally grew, gradually forming stable African-American communities. Over time, international condemnation and opposition to the slave trade grew stronger. At the end of the 18th century, the U.S. Constitution banned international slave trade, marking the end of this brutal trade. However, the end of the slave trade did not mean the end of slavery. In the United States, slave markets continue to exist, but they primarily dealt in African Americans rather than Africans. The African slave trade had profound impacts on Africa, the Americas, and Europe. For Africa, the slave trade led to a significant loss of population, destroying its social structure and economic foundation. For the Americas, the slave trade provided labor for plantation economies, promoting economic development, but also leading to long-term racial discrimination and social inequality. For Europe, the slave trade brought significant economic benefits, but also sparked moral and ethical controversies. Today, the African slave trade is part of history, but its impact still exists. Museums, monuments, and educational institutions around the world use exhibitions, research, and education to help people understand this history, reflect on its impact, and promote racial equality and social justice.